Okay, let's get started then. This is the 58th Security Thought Leadership webinar, and you're very warm welcome from around the world to what is an opportunity every Tuesday and Thursday to take a topic and examine it. And the idea of thought leadership is to critique what is going on today in order that we may have a better type of security tomorrow. And the topic today is thinking about the role of regulators. What is going right and what is going wrong? And the point about this topic is we've been hearing in the first 57 webinars, of course, about a whole range of issues which might, in some countries, in some circumstances, to be subject to regulators getting their act together and changing the security sector for the better. And some of these issues have cropped up as being the fault of regulation in some way or other. So what I've done today is I've invited three of the leading thinkers in the world on this subject matter. All three will be very well known. All three have been writing and discussing the subject of security regulation in very different ways, and they're from different parts of the world: Australia, United Kingdom and France. So what I'm going to do in a minute, as I always do, is I'm going to ask our panel to introduce themselves. Once they've done that, I will then invite each of them to make their opening statement, and then we'll invite you to ask any questions that you've got. And can I please invite you to use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen, and if you get your question in early, we'll endeavour to get to it as quick as we can. So without further ado, I'm going to go to my panel then and ask them to introduce themselves. I'm going to go to Australia, Queensland, Australia first, and Tim. Tim.
Thank you, Martin. Hello, everybody. Let me just say it's 12:30 a.m. here in Australia at the moment. I've actually been to bed and got up, but I'm feeling wide awake, which is really good, thanks to some coffee. So as Martin indicated, I've been studying the security industry and regulatory aspects of the industry for about 30 years now, which is slightly frightening. I've seen a lot of improvements in Australia and in my personal jurisdiction, which is Queensland, the state of Queensland. So here in Australia, the security industry is regulated on a state basis. So we have 8 regulators. So there's always innovation occurring in a different place, and usually there's some kind of scandal happening as well. And there's a constant learning process going on. But also around the world, I think particularly in Britain and Europe, some other parts of the world, we've seen significant documented improvements in the industry. So some of you might have read the work of Mark Button and his earlier associate, Bruce George. They developed a concept of breadth and depth in security industry training and regulation. So we know now that a lot of jurisdictions have significant breadth, that is coverage of the industry in terms of occupations that are licensed. So here in Australia, and I know many other locations, it's fair to say that pretty much every category of security industry work is licensed. So that involves disqualifying offences, minimum training, and a regime of sorts in terms of inspections, complaint investigations, and that kind of thing. And there's been a lot of academic research on the topic, and I think academics have produced a model system which we can very confidently say now is ideal. We could perhaps argue about some detail around the model, but basically I think there's a consensus model about what best practice looks like. And that comes out of the experience of practitioners and research on practice. The big problem, though, I think, is the transparency problem. There's this enormous lack of information from regulators about what they're doing. So I just had a look at the Security Industry Authority website today for the UK. It's probably one of the better ones in terms of statistics that it publishes about what it's doing. But there are a whole lot of questions I had that just don't have answers. And the same goes for my own jurisdiction in Australia. How am I going time-wise, Martin?
Yeah, you could take another minute or so. Carry on.
Okay, yeah. So just for example, if I'm the manager of a business or the manager of an institution, or perhaps just a interested citizen, and I want to know how the security industry is doing in terms of integrity and in terms of qualifications and competency in my jurisdiction or in my country, it's pretty much impossible to find out, I think, in terms of getting a good picture. So with the internet, we should be able to get quite good detail about how the industry is regulated and the impacts. So there's a real dearth of impact assessments, either academically produced or preferably produced by the regulators themselves. So that's pretty much in a nutshell for me. Thanks, Martin.
Tim, thank you very much indeed. Tim, and thanks for introducing yourself. Can I just ask Peter and Jonathan just to say who they are first, and then we'll do your opening statements. Peter, just say a few words about yourself first.
Right, so my name is Peter Stiernstedt, and I am a lecturer in criminology at the University of West London in London, doing a lot of research on the private security industry and its regulations.
Thank you very much indeed. And Jonathan, in France?
Hey, I'm Jonathan from France, so sorry for my accent. I'm junior lecturer in Maine University, which is actually a French region, and I'm sociologist, PhD sociology.
Okay,
Martin,
fantastic.
Martin,
So,
I forgot to say where I'm from.
Tim, you carry on.
Sorry, I work at the University of the Sunshine Coast. I'm a professor in criminology. I teach courses in crime prevention and policing.
And probably the leading writer in the world to date on this subject area. Another one, though, who's beginning to write more is Peter. So, Peter, can we have your opening statement, please?
You can, I will start with a cliche and I will end on something a bit more radical, I think. I do obviously agree with Tim as he points out that the regulation in Britain and Europe is definitely making progress. It's getting better from having been not so good, arguably. But there is obviously a tremendous speed in the growth of the size of the private security industry, possibly only paralleled by the growing expansion of role and responsibility. And this obviously put a tremendous strain on regulation and, equally important, on the regulators. Because I think that regulation and regulators are sometimes talked about a bit too symbiotic. I mean, there are two sides of the same coin, but comprehensive regulation doesn't necessarily mean good regulation due to an ineffective regulator. I think this is a point I would like to make more generally. I mean, to draw more attention to the emphasis of the actual regulator, because if the end result is poor regulation of the private security industry, a well-worded regulation won't drive the creation of an equally well-suited regulator as much as a strong regulator will push for and develop good regulation. So that's, I think, a point worth making, and the one that I see is not made as often as I would like to see. But what we are seeing is a privatization of security all over Europe. And the current security fashion, if you'd like, is for developed nations to adopt some sort of a security doctrine with increasingly specialized police functions, and then the non-security functions, they are increasingly outsourced to the private market. That's fine, but it also means transferring traditional associated tasks to the private security providers. And in the words of some of my academic sparring partners, this makes for an arena where commodity and non-commodity values kind of jostle and collide. So while this may seem very straightforward and not really posing a problem, it actually has some rather significant challenges. And I think partly due to those challenges, it's no secret, nor is it a surprise that the private security industry is one that has been and continues to be beset with uncertainties about its status and legitimacy and so on. And I mean, as research shows, the average citizenry in Europe is divided about their expectations of whether policing and security as a society ought to be delivered primarily by the state. So this, in my opinion, largely has to do with both regulation and, don't forget, the regulator, or lack thereof, because today I think we can discuss where areas of regulation being weak, but we can also discuss areas where it's completely missing. And with the actual Brexit now, allegedly at least, drawing closer, this may sound as a moot point, but I think that the solution actually lies on a European level. And here comes the more radical bit, because up until now, the institutions of the European Union have been very reluctant to intervene at the European level to set these minimum standards of private security regulation. This is a bit strange because the harmonization is at the forefront of many other policy areas, with the legislative harmonization of the private security industry being rather central to society, is completely absent. So I did cautiously allude to this in a paper back in 2017, and since then, actually, I've kind of solidified my belief that, do we need a supranational EU regulator of private security? No. But do we need an EU directive to govern the regulation thereof? Yes, and that is a firm yes. And I hope to expand on that and other ideas on private security regulation and regulators with you all here today. So thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. I will definitely come back to you on that important point about regulators. I have actually heard that put like that before, so thank you very much indeed for that. Okay, just to remind our audience, if you could use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions, we'll get straight to it after we've heard our opening statement from Jonathan. Jonathan, over to you.
Hey, I already have a question, but I didn't expect to go in that way. So on my point of view, I will focus on homeland security, you know, and actuality since the coronavirus changed lots of things in France. So I would like to go on the direction of a very special character in France, which is the préfet. It's an administrative position. The préfet is executive of the president in every region, and he is now going on a way where he is overpowered since March, you know. So I will discuss this very special role in the actuality of security, because this character, which was specialized in police force, had in 2009 security force, 2011 gendarmerie, then army, and now he has new powers since March. So this is the first point. Then I would question the fact that we have actually national and regional policy, which is very different. We have two levels of policy between the government, the prefect locally, which represents the president, and we have the mayor on the other hand. So there is a little trouble about regulation there. And at the end, very actual today is the problem of the nightlife policing and execution of the new power of this prefect, which is now shutting down gym, bars at 10, and everything is very arbitrary. So I would speak about the increase of arbitrary decision since March. Did you understand me?
Yes, let's carry on.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not used to speak like this on the web in English, so
You're doing very well.
New for me.
Thank you for speaking English.
Yeah, sorry for my accent.
Are you finished?
So that's it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
Me, I just
go on.
If I just may ask add something, I just would like to discuss the very actual evolution since March. That's it.
Well, just say a few words since March then. So you've made the point that it's contested territory, yes?
We had a confinement in March, April until the middle of May, and it was a national one, you know. And since maybe 3 weeks, we begin to experience local confinement, beginning slowly, silently, and we wonder where it will end and who is entitled to regulate about security and about everything.
Okay. Let me get to. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. Now, questions are piling in, so let's see if we can do some of these justice. Let's turn this on its head. I'll come to you first, Tim, if I might. Tim, you made the point about different areas of security being regulated. Arguably, the most important thing would be to get it right at the top of companies. If you get corporate security heads right, they buy the right type of security, the security world then becomes a better place. And Peter Fraser-Hopewell is asking about the potential for regulation of that part of the industry, which I guess around the world, Tim, has been outside any sort of scope of influence. But Why? Could it be? And what's the barrier? Tim first, if I might, and I'll come to Peter second.
I think in many locations which have what we could call comprehensive or wide regulation, that's the main area where there's a gap. In fact, as you've indicated, there's a yawning gap. So we do have this contradictory situation where employees of security firms must have security training and licenses, whereas the owners are not required to have those qualifications. So I think that is a deficit in most regulatory regimes. I think most governments have been dragged into regulation of the security industry. They've reluctantly taken on regulation of operatives, and making qualifications a requirement to be the owner of a security firm is just a bridge too far for many governments. Because of deference for laissez-faire economics and the right of anybody to set up a business independently. But I think there's this huge social benefit from private security, and I think it would be enhanced if we had some minimum requirements, knowledge of crime prevention and security management principles to hold a security company license. I'm certainly in that camp.
Okay. I guess that, Peter, I can move to you. It's obviously a big gap. Would you advocate it being filled by regulation?
I would. I mean, you won't get much disagreement from me. I mean, there's generally, if you look at it from a very broad perspective, you can regulate either the individual, the activity, or the organization. That's basically the three levels of or the items of regulation where you can address it. And in my opinion, I think that this echoes well with what Tim said. The primarily it's the individual that's been regulated, and then to some extent the activity, and then to a lesser extent the organization, and that's where there's a big gap to be filled. I think so. I agree largely, but I do think that the regulators do have a role to kind of balance that equation to make sure that regulation is more, if you like, comprehensive in the words of Button. So yes.
But Peter, is the problem, back to your point about the importance of the regulator? I quite like this, actually. I suppose many regulators listening might say, hey ho. But back to this point about the competence of the regulator. Is the reason we've got a gap because regulators don't get their act together, or as Tim says, it's about a laissez-faire, don't interfere with the market type of attitude by governments? Can we blame governments for this, or should we be saying to regulators, get your act together?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, but that's obviously a boring answer. But I do think it's a bit of both. I think it goes from the political sphere down to the regulators. But I do think that, kind of irrespective of whether or not they have political support, the regulators quite often doesn't have the teeth, knowledge, or capacity to act in a way which is effective. So in spite of very well developed regulatory frameworks, it's not as effective as it could be.
Okay, and just one quick follow-up to you then. And the reason they lack teeth, knowledge and capacity is because they're not seen to be important enough and funded properly, or they just haven't got their act together?
I would say the former in that case. I mean, I do think that they generally have their act together, but obviously you kind of lose your incentive and motivation at some point, obviously, if you are constantly playing at the back foot, if you'd like.
Okay. Let's move to Jonathan. Now, Jonathan, in your opening statement, you made the point that in France, there's various influences on the regulatory process. Out of interest, what's the most powerful one? President, mayor? I mean, which of those could have the most influence on the private security sector?
Right now, it's very complicated to summarize, but I would say that since 2011, we have an organization which is called the CNAPS, and the CNAPS is a controller of private security. So it's directed by a prefect. The prefect is, how to say that? He's named, he's put in charge by the president. So yeah, of course, president has a hand on it. And then it's the prefect. Locally speaking, it's the prefect which can withdraw your agreement if you are an officer. If you are an owner, he can shut down your company. So yeah, the prefect had the hand on private security in every region, and
And so
very strongly.
And Jonathan, they have influence over the owners of security.
Both. They can, in France, if you want to be an officer, you have to have 1 month of formation. After this, you have an agreement for 5 years, which is given by the prefect. The prefect can withdraw it and for how to say that, forbid you to work for 5 years. Then it's the same for the owner. The owner can can have how to say that. I don't know how to say it in English. Sorry.
That's right.
The owner can have to give money, compensation. He can have to give compensation for bad behavior, but he can be asked to stop his activity too. It's since 2011, and it increased 2011, 2012, and since that it changed a lot in the security business process in every region.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there, Jonathan, because I want to move on. And I want to go to the next question because we've got a lot of questions coming in. Tim, I'm going to come to you. Now, you mentioned something that's quite dear to my heart. And Peter Herwig has asked a question I was going to ask anyway, but let me give the credit to Peter Herwig. And he's talking about how do we, the wealth, the perception that security companies are seen to be the playboy of the privileged or the playgirl of the privileged. You yourself have written about the process of thinking differently about regulation and about the way that regulation can enhance. In your opening statement, Tim, you mentioned this point about the social benefits that accrue from private security. Much under discussed, don't you think? What's the role in regulators in this bit about enhancing the social benefits of a well-run private security sector? Tim?
Well, the regulator has to ensure that there are minimal standards of competency and integrity so that both government and private enterprises can employ and contract in security that is fit for purpose, so that money is not wasted on inadequate provision of security. We don't have significant problems with people having to sue security firms because of losses. And generally, the security industry is effective in preventing crime. And when I say preventing crime, we're talking about preventing assault and serious injury. We're talking about preventing sexual assault. We're talking about preventing people losing their hard-earned income. I mean, it's an incredibly important social benefit. But in theory, you could have the industry regulated very effectively by the government, and it is only wealthy people who benefit because they're the only ones who contract in security. But the reality is, in most societies, there is a benefit from private security engaged by private firms, so that people, when people go shopping, for example, their bags aren't stolen. Prices are kept down because there's not a significant loss from theft. They're secure walking around. And as well as that, government can be, and I think should be, a very large customer of private security, as well as directly employing security officers and security managers themselves and security providers themselves. And so if you look at public housing, if you look at public education, if you look at public transport, if you look at open spaces, if you look at large public events that are sponsored by government or managed by government in some way, private security can play a direct role in protecting people from crime and violence.
Yeah, okay.
But you've got to have those minimum standards first.
Well, yeah, you have, and I guess, Peter, and something you've written about as well, of course, Peter. You have got to have these standards, but the point you're making as well, in addition, is you've also got to have an effective regulatory regime. And I guess this is what this point about the enormous potential the private security has to benefit the wider public, which is not vastly discussed, I have to say, not in academic circles nor in practice. And I guess what your thoughts on what's the barrier to regulators being more effective in bringing about the potential for the private security sector to flourish and governments to see it as an unqualified good?
Well, I think that one of the major issues, but one of the major barriers I think to this date is the, again, very rapid speed with which this industry has grown and the role that is now taken. As Tim alluded to, we have a significant number of government functions, critical infrastructure, the security thereof now being outsourced to private security industry and their firms, which makes countries completely dependent on the provisions and the services of private security industry. Now, catching up with this is a tall ask, is a tall task for any government. I mean, you can look at, for example, I mean, Sweden is an excellent example, what thought of as one of the most well-regulated countries, at least with Europe and arguably in the world, that is still, you know, fighting quite hard, both in areas where the regulation is weak and also where it's non-existent. And then what do you do there? How do you bridge that barrier? If there's no regulation whatsoever, how do the regulator kind of step in and try to bridge that gap? That's a difficult one. I would say that the main issue, which kind of goes back to the previous question as well, is now to start further just communicating and setting up this more, if you like, community-based type of situations where you have industry, academia to an extent, and the private sector communicating and thus kind of understanding each other and more or less helping each other, given the centrality of the role that the private security industry plays.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds, in some ways, it sort of sounds obvious, Peter.
It does, and yet it isn't happening.
No, that's where I'm going. Yeah, but quite.
Yeah. No, but I know that at least myself and Button have been pushing for this for quite some time now, and it's we were fighting an uphill battle.
Okay. I'm going to come to you, Jonathan, and a question from Erica Gibbons, who, and one of the points, and this might be a very good one to ask about in the context of France, where she's asking about, as she says, regulatory compliance is complicated, expensive, and full of challenges. Is this not causing compliance fatigue, which is causing companies not to adhere? In other words, it's just all too much to comply with, making it all break down. I wonder whether that would be the case in France at all.
I understood your question. I'm sorry for that, but
so Erica Gibbons is just wondering whether the difficulty of complying with regulation means that there's fatigue, that it's just all too complicated, it's too extensive, it's too confusing, and as a consequence, the reason why regulation is not effective is because it's just too much for those who are regulated.
Yeah, it's a tough one. How to say? Problem in France is complicated. It's like we have lots of small firms. We have very few big firms, and big firms are very often foreigner firms. And the goal of the government is to make bigger firms, to have less people to speak with and to make easier the conversation with the social actors. So when it comes to regulation, in private security firm in France, how to say that, we go very often to firms which are funded by professionals themselves, and they very often or don't really know the regulation or passed by the regulation. And how to say that, it's something that the CNAPs try to change, to achieve and succeed slowly, but there is kind of silence since maybe 5 years, since 2015, you know, so it's hard to get data about it.
Okay, I understand that. I wonder whether I could, Tim, come back to you and overlapping this question is a question from Jerry Shields. Now, Jerry's actually read your work, I have to say, And the question he's got is, do you see the action security's been involved with during COVID-19 as a potential plus under your third pillar? Tim, in a second, I want you to explain what your third pillar is, alongside private security to the public interest, and how might this be built upon? Can you just explain what this means, Tim, third pillar? I'll come, Peter, to you obviously straight afterwards. But we've been hearing, Tim, on previous webinars about under COVID-19, the security sector has been engaged in a lot more frontline work, more important work, checking entries to buildings all of a sudden, policing queues outside supermarkets, and it's put security central. And of course, the question is all this going to be a plus, and what's the role of the regulator? Tim first, and then I'll come to Peter. Tim.
I think generally it's a positive. I mean, if people are seeing security officers at the front of shops or at COVID testing stations, and if they're helping keep the peace, maintain compliance with the rules to protect people's health, and we see this on television, we see when we go out to the shops or if we're going to a COVID testing station, and those people are acting in a way that is professional and polite, it's a positive for the industry for sure. Unfortunately, in Australia, you may have heard, we have had scandal associated with security guards and the second wave of COVID in the state of Victoria. So at the moment, the state of Victoria in Australia is still in a fairly high stage of lockdown. It was in a very high stage of lockdown in the last 2 months. And that was a result of an outbreak of COVID from 2 hotels where people were quarantined. And we actually have a Royal Commission of Inquiry going on right now into how that happened. The most likely finding is that it was associated with very poor private security provision at those locations. So very poor selection, training and supervision of security guards involved in hotel quarantine. So that's a very bad look for the industry. The only positive is that perhaps we'll have improved regulations coming out of that. It has shone a spotlight on security industry training in Australia and supervision, and shown how inadequate it can be. So that's problematic. If you don't mind, I'll just I might hand over that third pillar question to Peter.
Yes.
I think Peter's got more expertise in this area than I do.
Well, okay, I was going to say, let's do that. Peter, I mean, can you just explain what's meant by the third pillar? Because
right. So the third pillar is called the responsibility pillar. And as Gary alludes to, this is where the private security industry has kind of a responsibility against also the citizens and the society as a large to provide security, not only for profit, but also for public good. I think that the private security industry has had an enormous role to play in the COVID, and I do definitely see it as a plus as well. But there's also an argument for the need for minimum standards, because if we now have a pandemic, which is obviously global and it sees no borders whatsoever, most states are dependent on private security provisions to be able to secure and provide the testing facilities and so on and so forth, the controlling of shops and masks and public transport regulations, what have you. Now, with those rather significant responsibilities under this pillar, there has to be obviously a least level of competence for these people that are performing these tasks. And currently, obviously, there isn't. So the people that are performing these tasks in one country or one location may have very different competencies than someone in another. So if a country looks at the UK glances at France and think, well, that system worked very, very well. Well, you know what? You have to consider, are these security providers working and operating under the same type of regulations? Are they able to provide the same level of services? That then fulfills its responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point. I mean, it's a question. I'll just stick with you for a minute, Peter. Louis Werner has asked a question about whether regulations should be fit for purpose, when of course the purpose is a bit of a moving dynamic. I mean, I guess that's the point you're just making. should we seek to have minimum standards that across the board are the same? I mean, would that be better for the security if the world came together and recognized that there needs to be minimum standards here which apply across the board? Or is that just beyond what's possible? And I'm just trying to think about how we sell the advantages of private security globally when regulation varies so much, and yet the roles are essentially the same, right? The basic roles around the world are essentially the same. Your thoughts, Peter, on that one question?
Right. Well, my answer to that is yes. We do need to get the world together on this. I think that is important because security is obviously completely borderless. We need to be able to work across borders, and therefore having just one country doing their thing isn't really what we need. There has to be obviously a fit for purpose for each and every country over and above those minimum requirements. But in some countries there are no requirements effectively, and that just isn't good enough and won't work. So with this, I mean, look at the aviation industry, for example. It's heavily regulated, and that just makes sense to everyone because obviously airplanes very clearly moves across borders, but so does these security issues today as well. You just look at the COVID pandemic, where you have situations where obviously this travels very quickly across borders and doesn't really care about them. So the answer to that question, in my opinion, is a clear yes. We do need a universal minimum standard for private security regulation, and I think a first very easy step to that is to push for the directive at the European Union level. Doesn't really affect the UK in a couple of months, but the rest of Europe.
Yeah, okay. It was set a context. Okay, let me move on. I'm going to come to Jonathan now. And a question from Manja Abraham. Jonathan, you mentioned when you spoke about regulators, the army, the gendarmerie, the private security. And Manja Abraham's question is, in France, do private security take on police tasks? Do they take on tasks that otherwise, or is it a completely separate arrangement?
Yeah, it's a good question. It was not, but you have police rights. Police rights are just for police, so this will never go to private security. But since 1 year, private security is allowed to control speed, car speed, on the roads, which is brand new and was a big debate in France. And since the coronavirus news, some private security firms were allowed to use drones, to control the streets. So it was for a very short time on just a few towns, but it was a kind of test. So we can imagine that it will, how to say that, will be more common next years. Yeah. But for now, there is a very strict differences between both. This is private security in private space and police in public space. Yeah.
Okay, Tim, I guess around the world, your point about regulating the private security sector so that governments can want to buy it. Is there anything wrong in your view in governments or police service buying private security to do tasks that otherwise would have been seen as exclusively police? Because in those circumstances, the control is quite tight, isn't it? The accountability is still to the public. So some of the issues about only working in the interests of those who pay go out the window. Is that model, Tim, of governments buying or police services buying security to do tasks they otherwise would have done, is that one you would see as a positive going forward?
Potentially. It's difficult to say. I think there are core policing functions which no democratic government is going to let go of. As Jonathan said, for example, policing demonstrations and riots. I just can't see that happening with private security with, as you said, Martin, the command and control structure that police need. I think investigating serious crimes is probably not going to be outsourced either. But perhaps there could be flexibility around that area so that if, I could imagine a situation where some police forces might engage a private investigator on a case and might grant them some special police powers. But I think most of the outsourcing of traditional police work is going to be in fairly low level. I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but fairly low level patrol work or guarding work, particularly at major public events or at public buildings, government buildings, that kind of thing.
Should it be? But I mean, the point is that's the fact of it. But I mean, would you be against a regulatory regime that enabled some of these more complicated tasks, maybe not public order, I accept that one, but some of the more sort of less routine ones being passed to private security?
If it's shown to work, I mean, I guess it's got to be cheaper, or there has to be some kind of benefit. There has to be a clear benefit. And often the big attraction of private security, particularly in the personnel area, is that it's much cheaper. Typically half the security officer is half the price of a police officer. If they can do the job as well, and that can be demonstrated, and that there's not an added on cost to police or to government in extra supervision or extra regulation, then there's going to be a public benefit. I think it would have to be done on a case-by-case basis. There would have to be transparency and accountability around that process.
Okay, interesting.
Could I just add on that?
Yeah, come on, Peter,
Yep.
just come in.
I mean, I do have a case in point right there on the private security not reaching to public order, which it does, because in Sweden currently there are no-go zones, as you may or may not have read in the news, which are more or less actually now controlled not by the police but by their own population. And some of those areas within those regions have turned to private security to patrol their streets. So they're basically turning to private security to solve problems that the police are unable to. So we have public policing done by private security, and that's obviously they are effective, at least as it seems. But obviously there's a extremely difficult philosophical and if you'd like more governance discussion to have about whether or not this is the way it should be.
Yes, well, very interesting. I mean, gentlemen, I have to say, we could have gone on for ages. Always the sign of a good webinar is when you're running out of time and there's so many questions to ask. There's so many questions from the audience to ask as well. But I'm going to do this. I'm going to ask you for your final comments, each of you. And I guess my question is going to be focused on going forward. And just perhaps a few thoughts from each of you, and I'll start with you, Jonathan, is in terms of where we go from here, what would you like to see as the next stage in the effective regulation of the private security sector? And what's even worse than a complicated question, Jonathan, is I'm giving you 20 seconds to answer it.
What I would like to see is a specification of the competence of officers. I mean, a qualification for bouncers, for officers, night officers, for officers in shops, everything. But a consideration of the work as a risky job on some ways, and on a qualified job on some ways, and to stop to be a dirty job, you know, because for now in France, security officers are doing dirty jobs. So it needs to take in account what they are doing as a specialist.
Jonathan, you broke up a bit there, but we got the end point. Thank you very much indeed. Peter,
it's not a police job.
Okay, thank you. Nice point about nice perception. Peter, 20 seconds.
20 seconds. We need a EU directive to set minimum standards for private security regulation. Is this difficult? Yes. Is it unlikely? Yes. But just as Henry Ford once asked what people would like for their better transportation, they would say a faster horse. And I think just as he invented the car, we need to be imaginative, we need to be entrepreneurial, and we need to push for a EU directive setting minimum standards for private security regulation.
Okay, and Tim?
I'd like to see regulators do more to demonstrate effectiveness, and that is to publish as much data as they possibly can about the effects of their regulatory processes. So that means data about things like complaints, litigation, public opinion and experience of the security industry, license revocations, license application denials, a kind of a, an assessment of the integrity and the competence of the industry as a result of the regulatory process. And as part of that, to identify areas where there could be improvement.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your time. That was absolutely fantastic. Really enjoyed it. And thank you so much to the audience for questions. We didn't get through to so many of you, and I'm so sorry. It's a sign, I think, of a good webinar, and we will return to this topic in the future, I promise you. So thank you very much indeed to that. Just a few brief final comments. For those of you talking about excellence, the Outstanding Security Performance Awards, the OSPAs, if you're in the UK, nominations close tonight, midnight tonight. There's no extensions. Get your entry in by midnight tonight, or you miss out. In Romania and Germany, you've got a bit more time, 25th and 29th of October. And just to get a date in your diary, the OSPAs for the Benelux are open. We're going to do an online award ceremony in Benelux this year for obvious reasons. 24th of November, ASMC Congress, free to attend an award ceremony and a thought leadership summit. There's the email address, or just go to the OSPA's website, go to the Benelux, you can get in that way. And just to say, we're back again on Tuesday, as you know, we always will be here every Tuesday and Thursday. We're going to be talking about remote networks, why working from home continues to test the CISO, and next Thursday, secured by design, an outdated concept or still good core to good security practice. Thank you once again to everybody from around the world for their questions. Thank you once again to my panel. Christine Brooks and Hannah Miller in the background, of course, do their excellent job and they don't get seen, but thank you to them. I hope to see you next Tuesday or next Thursday. And until then, wherever you are in the world, stay safe.